Good morning, everyone. How are you doing today? Can you see me? Can you hear me today? Okay, so welcome to day 3 of this essay writing workshop. So initially this was supposed to be day 3 out of 4. But as you may have noticed, I have decided to add one extra day for us to be able to cover all the content in depth. I have already signed you up for this additional day, so you don't have to do anything. If you are here today, you are already registered for day 5, which will take place on Friday. Yeah, so this will just give us a bit more time to discuss everything in detail. So what is the program for today? What do we have to do today? Let me just find the original agenda so we can have a brief look at the various topics that we are going to discuss. So unlike what we have done so far, what we did yesterday, what we did 2 days ago, we mostly focused on a limited range of topics. On day 1, we mostly talked about the assessment objectives. Yesterday, we mostly talked about how the most common mistakes and how to fix them, to avoid or to prevent them. And we also talked about how to make a good point, how to write an argument. Today is going to be a bit different. Today, we are going to talk about various topics. You should be able to see them. These are all the topics that we have over there. Actually, what I did when I was delivering this workshop in Hangzhou, when I was doing this face-to-face, what we did back then is that we made several groups. We made I think 4 or 5 groups of participants, and each group was expected to prepare a presentation, a short presentation about this topic, and then we would all share our experiences to enrich the presentation that was given. Obviously, I asked myself whether it would be a good idea to do this online, but it's always more difficult, right? It's always more difficult to make this group work effective online. So instead of doing this in smaller groups, I've decided to make this all together, so we can just move from one topic to the next, and each topic should take 15 to 20 minutes. So we should have enough time to cover the entire content, which means that tomorrow, day 4, see, there is a change. Day 4, we'll talk about the fine art of evaluation. We'll talk about the planning and the structuring of an essay. And then on day 5, on Friday, we will we'll look at some answers from students, to analyze them, to identify the strength and the weaknesses. I have already received some samples from your students. As I mentioned before, if you want us to have a look at the work of your students on day 5, please send me their essays. Could be pictures, but it's better if it's a Word document or PDF document. It's just easier to write comments, but it's fine. Even if it's handwritten, you can send me pictures and we can work with this. Okay, so there is no precise order. Well, let's just follow the topics, and let's just start with how to give valuable feedback to your students. And let's just, before I open the PPT and before I start the presentation, perhaps let's just start by sharing some practices that you use, that you have implemented to make sure that you give valuable feedback to your students, especially because this is an essay writing workshop, especially when they write an essay. What type of feedback do you give them? And how do you make sure that they learn from their mistakes, and that thanks to the feedback you give them, they can improve from one piece of work to the next. Would anyone like to share some successful strategies that have been implemented to achieve that? Anton, do you have a new mic?
No, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Anyway, so one of the things my students have to do is make a type of list of objectives. They make a list of things they are going to work on. They shouldn't work on more than 4, 5, or 6 items at a time. It needs to be individual, and it should be based on past feedback either by me or by their peers. So from feedback, they write down what they should work on, and later on, they need to prove through a later essay that they wrote that they improved or that they did that better. So basically, through the feedback, which usually I prefer to give one-on-one, they make objectives, and they need to sign off those objectives in the future before they can proceed to next objectives.
But I do believe you have many AS and A2 students, Anton, am I right? How do you give one-on-one individual feedback when you have close to, I think you told me you had close to 100 AS, or was it last year that you had close to 100?
Yes. Yeah, that was fun. You're right. I cannot always give to everyone, but there are those who need it more than others. For some, just the short written feedback on a test or on an essay works. For some, I give them feedback online over Edmodo, so I can write a bit more detailed there and discuss it a bit better. For papers where I really think from, okay, this is something that needs to be discussed one-on-one, I give a special mark, and I make time, either during some of the class. Sometimes I go to school in the evening when they have their self-study time, or again, I leave a type of voice message or something, or Edmodo larger talk to them. So I do try to do that, but especially in such a large group, a lot of the feedback should come from peers. So I try to teach them to peer evaluate, and basically I monitor that for quite a lot of the classes. And this happens especially around the mock examination, of course, between the mock and the final examination. So yeah, peer feedback is very important in that as well. And of course, picking those who really need it.
Thank you very much, Anton. Yeah, I also believe that implementing student peer reviewing is extremely effective. We will have a dedicated session on this later today. It is also very challenging to implement it successfully. And the first time I tried to implement student peer reviewing, it was not a big success. So now I think I understand what mistakes I made and the reason for which it was not successful. So hopefully through the upcoming presentation, I will share with you some tips on how you can actually implement it and hopefully make it successful.
Yeah, students need to be ready for it and trained really step by step, and they need the right framework. I'll see if I can find the forms I use for that for showing to the group later.
All right, absolutely. Thank you very much, Anton. Would anyone else like to share some strategies that you have implemented to give valuable feedback to your students when they write an essay? Would anyone else like to share? No one else?
Professor, I have a question.
Yes, Shoaib, go ahead.
Yeah, is there any standardized form or standardized method given by Cambridge for that purpose to the teachers?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
Maybe there is, but I think I had a look at pretty much all documents that were released, that were produced by Cambridge. I have attended the two CIE trainings, the introductory and the extension training. And I've never heard about any document that would give guidelines for teachers to give feedback. If I'm wrong, I'm sure someone will correct me, but I don't think it actually exists. I've never heard of it anyway. I don't think so. I really don't think so, honestly. Maybe in other subjects, who knows? Maybe there are such documents in other subjects to guide teachers, but for economics, I don't think so. Anyone else would like to share some strategies? No? Okay. So the first thing that is that we should start with is, why does it matter? Why is it important for us to give feedback to our students and not just to write the score and say, all right, you should do better next time? Because of course that's not going to be very effective if we do that. So feedback is essential, yes, because it helps students identify what they did well. Okay, of course, when you give feedback, you should not only focus on mistakes, you should also identify what is good and what has improved. What can be improved and how. Okay, so it's not only about saying, okay, this is good, this is bad. The feedback should also give some advices on how to improve the areas in which there are still some weaknesses. Okay, it can also help students to clarify learning objectives and expectations. Also, for example, on day one, we talked about the assessment objectives. When you give feedback to the students, this is also the opportunity to tell them that something like, hey, look, you forgot to give an example. Hey, look, you forgot to give a proper definition of this keyword. Hey, look, your essay is one-sided, or there is no evaluative comment. So this is also the opportunity to reinforce the importance of the learning objectives and assessment objectives, and to tell the students, hey, look, you did this well, you have demonstrated these skills, or in this area, you have not clearly demonstrated your skills. So that's also one reason for which it is important. And also feedback can improve a student's confidence, okay? Because through your feedback, they should be able to identify, and you should recognize the progress that they have made. So that's something that can stimulate their motivation, their self-confidence. It's important because it can improve their self-awareness, to know where they are, to know how far they are from achieving or meeting the standard to get an A, for example. And at the end of the day, this can stimulate enthusiasm for learning. Also because it's a signal when you give detailed feedback to your students. It's also what you essentially tell them is that you care about their success, you care about them, and you are willing to spend time and energy to help them, to support them. And I'm pretty confident that this is something that that can motivate students, that can improve your relationship with the students. I think I wrote that after. Feedback is a form of communication between teachers and students. And the more feedback, the more detailed, the more helpful feedback you give them, it is something that can really improve the relationship that you have with them, and that can stimulate their, again, motivation, can cultivate a sense of mutual respect and understanding. So you see, there are many reasons. And also individual feedback is an instrument that we can use to implement differentiation, because of course, if you have a higher ability student, it's likely that your feedback will really focus on details it's likely that the essay is good overall, but you will be more demanding as soon as there is a tiny mistake, a small thing that can be improved. For example, you are more likely to write something about it, to point it out, than if you have a much weaker student. In that case, you will simply focus on the most serious mistakes, the areas that really deserve improvement and that can substantially increase the students' performance. So, of course, you don't give the same feedback to a very high ability student and to a much lower ability student. It's important to have reasonable expectations for each student, and the feedback has to be targeted to each individual student. Angela, you raised your hand. Is there anything you want to add?
Yes, I want to ask you a question. Yesterday, we made the common mistakes, the shared chart, remember? So I wonder if you use that for the whole class, for your students, or you just use it as a tool for yourself?
Oh, no. So this table is then shared, the table like we built yesterday with the most common mistakes solutions. Of course, it's not something for me. I don't really, actually, it still benefits me, because then it gives me it gives me the big picture of the most common mistakes, and then when I teach, of course, it helps me to prevent those mistakes by giving additional information during my lessons and warning the students in advance, because I know, hey, many students make that mistake, so make sure you don't make that mistake. But of course, this table, once it is filled, it is something that I print and give to the students. Obviously, that's not something that I only keep for myself.
Okay, so have you ever thought about maybe students can do it by themselves if we teach them?
Yes, okay, of course, and this we can talk about this in the session about the peer reviewing, because it has to do with the students' involvement in the marking or assessment process. So of course we can talk about that in a later session, Angela. But yeah, that's definitely something that can be done to involve students in the process and ask them to identify what the most common mistakes are. However, it is a bit difficult because students, they do not read everyone's essay. So they don't have as much information as you have. When you read 20 or 30 essays, you know what the most common mistakes are. When you have one student that only reads one essay written by one of his or her classmates, this might not give enough information to identify what mistakes are the most common. That might be a limitation.
Thank you.
So these are, of course, it's not an exhaustive list, but these are the few reasons for which feedback is important. So now I'm just going to give some tips, some methods, some things you can use. So of course, you don't have to do everything, but you might use some strategies listed in this PPT, experiment and see what works for you, what works for your students. So of course, the first thing that I believe is important is to assign an amount of work that allows you to give sufficiently elaborated feedback. Okay, if you give your A2 students 2 essays per week to write, and if you have 30 A2 students, I really don't see how it would be possible to give detailed feedback, individual feedback, I mean, of course. And at some stage, it's not going to be very useful if you assign too much work, because the feedback that you will give is just going to be too limited. So be smart about this. Of course, this depends on how many students you have. It depends on your teaching schedule, your extra responsibility, how much you are willing to sacrifice to give feedback to students. But it takes time. You know how time consuming it is to mark an essay. So in my case, for an A2 essay, it takes me around at least 15 minutes, okay, to really read it and to give detailed feedback. It's very long. So and I don't give a lot of homework compared to other teachers, because I don't want to rush through the marking and feedback process. So to me, it's I would rather choose quality of homework rather than quantity. So that's why, as the first advice. So sometimes schools have rules that you should assign at least a certain amount of homework per week. Okay, but then you can be smart about it. You can assign some MCQs. You can just check their folders, and or you can do other things to meet the rules that are implemented by your school, and make sure that you do have sufficient time to assign homework. Anton, you say I prefer marking with the student present so I can give feedback as I go. Yes, absolutely. This is something that you will see later in the PPT, to sit down with them and to mark the essay with them. It is extremely effective because you can give them feedback, but you can also ask them to clarify. Sometimes when you read the essay, I don't really understand what you wrote here. Can you tell me what you had in mind? So you can really have a form of exchange about their essay, to clarify and to explain directly why something has to be improved, or to point what has been improved since last time. So yeah, absolutely. If you have the possibility to mark, to give feedback with the students sitting with you, that's amazing. But of course, it depends on how many you have and whether it's possible in terms of your timetable. Okay, so assign an amount of work that allows you to give in-depth feedback. So of course, individual feedback is, I want to say, required. Collective feedback is also very important, but it doesn't replace individual feedback. Okay, so at least you should always give individual feedback to students. Collective feedback can be useful too in the classroom. So this type of collective feedback can be to give them the table that we built yesterday. So just to identify, I don't know, 5, 6, or 10 most common mistakes that were made in the essay, and a solution to solve it. So this is a form of collective feedback. But usually what I do before I give back the homework, I just talk about that piece of homework for 5-10 minutes, and I just explain to them, this is what you were expected to write about. This is the content that you could have included. And many of you talked about this, but you misunderstood. So I like to give this oral form of collective feedback before giving the homework back. But of course, in addition, I give a lot of individual feedback. Sometimes I write more than the students themselves when I give feedback, and sometimes that's something that I have to correct myself, because I sometimes the feedback I give is a bit overwhelming. So that's something that I have to correct myself. Let me have a look at the chat box to make sure that I'm not missing any of your comments. How long does it take you to assign or to mark, Angela? To assign it, because to assign an essay, 1 minute, do this. But to mark, yeah, to mark 8 to 20 minutes, yeah, it varies a lot. It varies a lot depending on the essay question itself, depending on how much the student has written. Yeah, so I think Anton's estimation between 8 and 20 minutes is fair. Yeah, it can be quite long. So if you have 100 students, it's a full-time job. Okay, so for comments, when you give feedback, comments have to be specific. Yeah, if you just write something like good, or not clear, or too vague, or it's not very useful, it's not very practical. If you want students to be able to understand what you mean, and to use your feedback to make things better in the future, your comments have to be very specific, very practical, very easy to understand. Okay, so try to avoid very general, broad comments. Okay, so make a list of the most common mistakes. So that's what we did yesterday. So this is a form of collective feedback that you can use with your students. If you are very dedicated, you can actually write the answer yourself, just to give them an example, like full answer, I mean. So, okay, let me be honest about this. I don't do this for AS and A2, but I do this for IGCSE. So for IGCSE, I write the full answer. And especially when they write, I usually have one class per week with my IGCSE student where they just do a test, paper 2 for IGCSE. And I usually what I do is that I do the test with them. Okay, with them at the same time. I mean, so they write the test, and on my computer I type the answer, and I try to finish it before the end of the lesson. Okay, so then I can actually print the answer before they leave the classroom, so they have an immediate form of. It's not really a feedback, but it's an example that they can use to compare their work with my work. My work is not perfect, but it's good enough. Something that you can try, but it has its limitations. So you got to be careful with this. You could invite other teachers to give feedback to your students. The reason for that is because it's your students, they might benefit from having their work graded or marked by someone else. Perhaps another teacher can give some feedback that you would have overlooked, or to explain things, or to give a feedback, to write the feedback in a different way that would make more sense to students. So you could team up with the other economics teachers from your department. You could even team up with other teachers from other schools. Why not? But there is a big limitation, and something you really have to be careful about if you choose to experiment with this, is that you need to make sure that the feedback you give them is not going to be in conflict with the feedback that other teachers give to your students, right? If you tell them do this, and you have another teacher that say, no, you should not do this, you should do that. Obviously, this is something that is going to be very confusing for students. But on paper, it's always interesting to have more diverse opinions about a student's work, and this is something that could benefit students. Just like it's, I for example, for AS and A2, I'm very lucky in my school because I co-teach. We are two economics teachers, and we share the AS and A2 lessons. So there is myself and a Chinese teacher, and I think it's amazing for students because they have two different approaches. Of course, we work together, but two different ways of explaining things, and this diversity is a chance for students, because the way I explain things might make sense to some, but not to others. The way in which my colleague explains to students might make sense to the others, but not to. You see, it can just this diversity can be beneficial, but be careful. The feedback has to be. How can I say that? You need to make sure that the feedback is coherent. Okay. Helen, you raised your hand. Do you want to say something?
Hi, Dr. Yes, I just have a very quick question. So I provide like very detailed feedback to my students because I basically spend all my spare lessons on like marking essays. So do you think it is valuable for students to like rewrite the essays according to your feedback?
Thanks, Helen. That's a very good question. And I think this is something that I noted later in the PPT. Yes, of course. Again, this is not something that I usually do. Perhaps I should. So what you're saying is that you give them feedback, and then you ask them to rewrite the essay to force them, to encourage them, let's say, to encourage them to read your feedback, because you know what it's like, right? If you spend 20 minutes or 15 minutes writing detailed feedback to your students, and then you give them their homework back, well, most of them, they will, maybe not most of them, but some of them, they will simply look at the grade, and then their essay is gonna be lost somewhere at the bottom of their bag, and they're not even going to read the feedback that you give them, and therefore that is a waste of time for you. So you're right, Helen, that this method to require them to rewrite the essay is a very effective method to encourage them to read your feedback, to understand their mistakes, and to take actions to fix them, to fix their mistakes. But in that case, this really requires that you not only you help them identify what they have done well and what could be improved, but the feedback should of course also include some strategies or some advices to make things better. Okay, otherwise they might be a bit lost, they might not really know how to rewrite the essay. So this method, I believe it's very effective to encourage them to read the feedback, but this also puts more pressure on you, because it means that your feedback has to be more specific and to give them directions on how to improve their essay. Yes, Angela?
Here's some experience I want to share about the rewrite. So usually if the students, I feel their attitude is a problem, their points is very, very vague. They didn't answer the question. I asked the students to rewrite. And for some students whose points are okay, and just some, maybe 1 or 2 points are not very good. So I asked the students to rewrite part of it, make the points clearer than before. Yeah, that is my experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Yeah, the only situation, and again, perhaps I should do this more often, the only situation where I ask students to rewrite the essay is when I really assess that they have not put sufficient effort in it. You know, sometimes you can tell that the work has been rushed. They have not even tried, and in that case, yes, I say no, you do it again. I'm not going to mark this. That's just disrespectful to me to rush your work like this. So in that case, I do require them to do it again, and I don't even mark the first version. But on a general basis, yeah, I think, Helen, you are absolutely right. It's a very good practice, and I think it is included in the PPT. Okay, so implement student peer reviewing, like Anton mentioned, and again we have a dedicated session about that, or topic about that later today. It is not easy, so that's why I think there are a lot of if you want to try to do it first, I think it's a bit late to do it this year, this academic year. It is really something that should be started from the very beginning of the school year to do that step by step. And there are many other mistakes that you can make when trying to implement this process. Many mistakes I made myself. So today we will try to understand how it should be if you want to try to implement student peer reviewing, and hopefully the method that I will share with you is going to be effective. Let me just have a quick look at the chat box. Anton, you said students should be told the English general paper or such an econ essay have some different objectives and ways of writing, so they understand what is similar and what is different. Absolutely. And then problem with example essays and too detailed content feedback and rewrite is that they get too focused on a specific answer or question, while some different answers may be fine too, and they need to get used to different questions in their thinking. Yes, of course, when I give them a model answer, I often tell them this is not the answer, this is not the right answer, this is my answer, okay? And there are other ways you can approach this essay question. There are other possible structures, there are other possible concepts that you could have included, there are different possible evaluative comments. This is just an example, so it's true that they should not regard this as, oh, that's what we had to do. No, that's just one possibility among many others. Yes, you should, if you can, sit down with your students to review their work together. Okay, that's absolutely, I believe, the ideal way to provide feedback. If you can do that, that's the best type of feedback you can give them. Give feedback in a timely manner, and this echoes the first point: assign an amount of work that allows you to give in-depth feedback. Because if you assign, if the students give you their work on let's say Monday, and you give them the feedback 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, they will not even remember what the homework was. They would not even remember what challenges they faced when completing it. And their incentives to read your feedback and try to correct their mistakes are going to be very low. So again, I realize that we all have time constraints and it can be difficult to give feedback in a timely manner. So also you should try to, when deciding how much homework to assign, this is something that you should take into account. It's not very useful to assign an essay question if you anticipate that you will be only able to give feedback 2 or 3 weeks later, of course. So what do I mean by a timely manner? It's always hard to say, but within a week, okay, between 2-3 days and a week maximum. If it's more than a week, the effectiveness of your feedback is going to be greatly diminished. So try to keep this in mind. Eve, you have raised your hand. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, can I ask a question about the student peer reviewing?
Okay, go. We will have a dedicated session, but please ask the question.
No, I just have a quick question. Like, in your experience, is it like, what would you usually do? Do you let students form their own group? I mean, do you believe that good friends make good team, or you form the student group for the peer reviewing? So you have a group 1, group 2, group 3, based on the students' learning ability, like top student review other top students' homework, or you just let them, for their own group.
Thank you very much, Eve. I think Anton raised his hand. Maybe you want to answer, Anton?
Yeah, this was also part of my master's study. And one of the things that I found is because when I implemented this and did some tests within my school, I tried all 3 main options. And I found that initially, friend groups may be best to begin with. Why? They are more likely to be willing to show their friends their mistakes. They know those people, they're usually reasonably similar level, they're willing to help each other. So in the beginning of the year, I started with friend groups. Then, when they started to get used to how to give feedback, I put them in random groups, but I made sure there were different levels in it. So some based on mixed ability. This way they could give relatively useful feedback. At least one person in the group can really help the others. Well, this of course gets annoying for the high ability students who keep helping others and not really progressing much. Of course, when you make this type of group, your main responsibility is also giving feedback to the higher ability students. So it really, as a teacher, you're really helping the high ability students. You could say the high ability students are helping their groups. Then in the later stage, I switched to by ability. So then I put ability together because they can help each other quite well and they can be trusted to work well. And I put the problem cases together. And then usually I really sit in with the problem cases to help them specifically. So my answer would be, I would use all 3 at different points for different reasons.
Thank you very much, Anton, for sharing this. You mentioned this was part of your essay. Was this like a PGCE or something like that? Is this something you could share with us, perhaps?
Yeah, I can have a look. Those documents that I wanted to send are part of that as well. So
okay.
Still need to find it, but yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Anton. So yeah, we will talk more in more details. Actually, if you are, it seems like there is a strong interest towards student peer reviewing. So then we can make we can cover this topic next after giving feedback, and it's connected, of course. Let's just finish this. I don't think there is much left. Yeah, something that I do, and I think it's a very simple trick that really makes everyone's life much easier. I always require students to write every other line, okay? So to skip 1 line every time. when they write on paper, of course. So I have enough space to write comments, because otherwise it is so difficult if you give detailed feedback to find enough space where to write. So you have to write very small and far from the text. It is much, much, much easier if you always have one empty line below what they write. So every time there is something you want to write, you have enough space. It's more comfortable to write your feedback. It's more comfortable for students to read your feedback. So just tell them, okay, every time you write, you write every other line, you skip one line every time. So that makes it much easier to write and read the feedback. Simple trick, very useful. And use a green pen rather than a red pen. I noticed, actually had a bad experience last year with a student, and I had an A2 student last year who was doing relatively well, but still that was around like a C or a B, a high C or low B. And I used to give a lot of feedback to her, but she and I used a red pen back then, and she was very upset because when she saw her essay with all the red, she felt, oh, I'm so bad, my essay is so bad, because and she told me that, oh, that's because of the color. And I actually asked her as a joke, would it be different if I used a green pen? And she said, yeah, absolutely. I would be more willing to read the feedback, and I would not feel so bad when looking at my homework. So I said, okay, and now I only use a green pen. So of course, I don't know if it changes things for students, but yeah, maybe red is more aggressive, has a more negative connotation or signal than if you read a green pen. Maybe the green pen is more stimulating, more positive. It encourages students more. Honestly, I don't know, but why not? I actually like using dark green pens to give feedback rather than red. Maybe this can have a positive psychological impact on students. You can ask them, just would you like red or green, just to be curious about what they have to say. Why not? What else? Yeah, so of course your feedback must be clear, specific, and helpful. So specific, I've already mentioned that. Clear, so be careful with your handwriting, of course. I know we are all rushed when we mark essays, but if your feedback is not readable, that's not very useful. And helpful means that, yeah, it's something that has to be constructive. Your feedback has to be constructive, all right? If you just write no or incorrect, it's not very helpful, because it doesn't really give any advices to, it doesn't really explain the mistake, and it does not provide any solution to fix it. And at the end of the essay, it's always, or at the beginning, besides the grade, it's always a good habit to summarize your overall assessment of your students' work. Because if you don't summarize, if you just give feedback in the essay, it might be difficult for the student to know overall what you think of his or her work. So I like to write one or two sentences at the beginning or at the end of the essay, just to say, okay, so overall, that's what I think, just to summarize my overall opinion over the work. Feedback has to be detailed, but not overwhelming. That's the mistake that I make. I tend to give too much feedback, and yes, it can be overwhelming for some students. So this is something that I'm trying to work on to make sure that, because if you write too much, students will just say, oh, no, they might just lose the motivation, and they might not be willing to go through everything you write. It can be too much. And then you want to do well by giving a lot of feedback, but at the end of the day, it's not very effective because they don't read it, because it's too much. So make sure that the amount that you give is reasonable, okay? Enough feedback, sufficiently detailed, but not too much. Everything has to be balanced, of course, and be kind and patient. Okay, do not write "you suck" on the work of your students. Try to be as positive as possible. They make mistakes. They will make the mistake several times. All right, it's a good way to build up your patience and always remain kind to your students. And yes, you may require students to use your feedback to improve their work, so to rewrite the essay. We've already talked about this. Something that you can do, and I think that's the last point, is something you can try to do is to give the feedback by audio or even by video. Why not? In my case, this is something that is that helps me because I have a problem of focus. I tend to lose focus very quickly when I write, when I mark essays, because this is not the favorite part of my job, and there is always something else that is more attractive to me. So I often start reading an essay and then I stop halfway through and I do something else, and it's a very bad practice, of course. So by recording a video feedback or an audio feedback, this forces me to remain focused from the beginning to the end of the essay. And that's actually one, it saves me a lot of time because I don't waste time doing other things. So if you, like me, have problems to focus and to remain focused from the beginning to the end of an essay when marking, this could be an interesting solution to record the feedback. Could be a video, could be audio. And then well, of course, I put the feedback on my website, and then my students have access to the list of videos. That's a possibility. All right. To me, it helps me because, again, I tend to lose focus when marking. Okay, and I think that's it. So you see, there are quite a few tips, so you don't have to do everything, and I do not do everything myself. But I hope that this list of tips or methods to give valuable feedback will be inspiring and will encourage you to try new things with your students and to implement things that work, and maybe to leave aside things that are not really possible or that you consider will be less effective with your students. Okay. Let me just have a look at the chat box before we move on. Oh, okay. I didn't know that writing the name in red means death. Okay, so I'm glad I use green pens. Good. Angela, you said, do you co-teach with another teacher in different units or same ones? Interesting question. So for AS, I teach the content, and my colleague will mostly focus on practicing reviewing. Summarizing, practicing, and so on. And for A2, we have actually divided the syllabus. I teach macroeconomics and she teaches microeconomics, because for A2, you don't really need any of the microeconomics content to teach macro. So that's what we do, and it's very effective. We are pretty much done with the syllabus already, and usually it took me much longer to finish the A2 syllabus, but with this organization, we were able to finish the syllabus much quicker, which means that we will have plenty of time to practice before the exam. But again, last year things were different, but this is how we do things this year. But it really depends on your timetable. It depends on the skills of each teacher. It depends on the number of students. It depends on so many factors. So this is really a decision that you have to make in your school, talking with your colleague and taking into account all the variables that are relevant to your school. Okay, does anybody want to add anything about how to give valuable feedback? Let me prepare.
I think you have said it all, Professor.
There are many, you see, there are many ways in which you can give valuable feedback to your students. Again, try not to implement too many new methods at the same time. once we get back to school, try one thing new. If it works well, you implement it, and you can try to implement another one later. Let's do that step by step, okay? All right, so let's do the student peer reviewing, how to implement student peer reviewing. And again, this is not really something that I do with all my groups of students. I only do it with groups of students for which I consider that this can be effective, productive. So again, I am not an expert at implementing student peer reviewing, but I know that this is something that can be quite useful. So I did some research about how we should do it effectively. And so I'm mostly going to present the output of my research work on how we should implement student peer reviewing. So for this particular topic, I do hope that those who have successfully implemented that process and those who have experience implementing student peer reviewing can share what strategies were successful, what strategies were not successful, because again, I'm just going to present what I learned from different sources, but I have very limited experience myself of implementing student peer reviewing. Okay, so I'll do the presentation first, and then those who have tried that before can share with us. Okay, so what are the main advantages? Why would it be interesting to implement peer reviewing? So review, what does it mean? We see again. Okay, so it's like to read the essay with a different set of eyes. So that's something that can be useful because it provides a different opinion and additional feedback. Reviewing is not the same as proofreading, okay? When we talk about student peer reviewing, this is not to correct spelling mistakes. That's definitely not what peer reviewing is about. This is not about the English, it's the overall assessment of the essay, its content, its structure, its coherence, the relevance of the argument. It's an overall appraisal of the work. Okay, so reviewers can provide the writer incredible insight since they are able to see the text with fresh eyes, okay? That's essentially the one, not the only one, but one advantage of using student peer reviewing. It allows students to provide and receive feedback because, of course, there will be, when you implement that process, every student will be expected to provide feedback to a classmate, but also to receive feedback from their peers. And the most effective way to do it is to implement that process before submitting the work to the teacher, okay? You could do it after, but of course it makes more sense to have students write their essay, and before they give it to you, to work with their classmates to try to improve it, okay, to implement this student peer reviewing process before submitting the homework. And yes, so when students give and get peer feedback on assignment in progress, they can remind each other of assignment goals and criteria. So just like we mentioned before, when I explain why it is important to give feedback, because that's one way to help students to understand whether or not they have demonstrated their skills, the skills that were required for this particular assignment. Okay, all right. So students can also get a sense of how readers might respond to their writing. So it could be in terms of the format, could be the content, could be that, oh, I don't really understand this sentence. What did you mean? It's not very clear, or something like, oh, you really repeat yourself here. Or this example, but I don't really understand this example. So that's very interesting because the way we write and what we mean when we write might not be understood the same way by people who read. So it's interesting to implement this type of reviewing process to just double check whether what you meant when writing is understood by the reader. Yeah, and therefore to make targeted changes to improve their assignments before submitting or presenting them. So for example, if a reviewer consider that this sentence doesn't make sense, or that it is one paragraph is off topic, or that this example is not relevant, or that it is not sufficiently detailed. This is the reviewer can give advices to the writer on how to improve it before submitting the assignment. So overall, it really empowers students because it gives them the responsibility of helping each other, of giving feedback to their classmates. It develops their critical thinking, okay, because it's not only about reading, it's also about criticizing, not only negatively, but also positively, the work of their peers. And of course, developing critical thinking is definitely something that we must encourage for our students. It helps them identify strengths and weaknesses in their essays, allows them to learn from each other, and teaches them how to deal with criticism. Quite important, okay? Because yes, if my classmate tells me that, yeah, I don't think your this argument makes much sense, okay, maybe this is gonna hurt our feelings a bit, because we never really like to be criticized, okay? But that's something we have to live with. It's okay to be criticized, of course, if it is constructive, not if it's very aggressive, or if it is not, as long as it is constructive, it's okay to be criticized. That's something that we should all learn. And as an educator, because of course it does not only benefit students, it also benefits you, implementing student peer reviewing will allow you to spend less time grading and more time on other important instructional tasks that you love. Why? Because through this student peer reviewing process, many mistakes have already been fixed or corrected once you receive the assignments. So in theory, if this process is effective, you should be able to move faster, to give less feedback, because most of the feedback has already been given by students, and therefore this means that this free more time for you to do other things like designing innovative lesson plans, working with students one-on-one. So you do, as an educator, you do benefit from this process. Okay, so I started by why is it useful? What are the main benefits of using implementing student peer reviewing? Before I move on about how to do it on practically, let me just have a quick look at the chat box again. Anton, you said, as you are right, for some students this does not work. Yes, it still allows you to let those who can use it use it. This frees time to the teacher, okay, as I mentioned, who can now spend more time to help those who really need the teacher more. Absolutely. For some students, they will be very responsive to this peer reviewing process, and they will be more independent. They will be able to work with their peers. And this gives you time to just sit down with those for which it's more complicated to take part in this process. So that's extremely useful as well. Okay. Okay, yeah, so first, you're right. First, teach them basic self-assessment. You're right that this is something that has to be gradual, and that's what I'm gonna say right now. And then peer assessment. How are students' English abilities, especially writing? Which pen can they get? Well, it depends. For most of my students, English is not really a big issue. Okay, their English is not amazing, but it is good enough to communicate, to write an essay in a coherent way, in a way that can be understood, at least in AS and A2. In IGCSE, sometimes things are a bit different, but I would not really regard that that English is a big obstacle to most students, because again, we don't really mark their English abilities. So as long as they can write sentences that can be understood, it's fine. Okay, so how do we do it? How, if you want to try to implement peer reviewing, and this is usually something that would be very much appreciated by your head of department or even the upper management of your school, so you can do that. It's often quite innovative. Tip number one: limit the scope for the reviewer. if you just give one essay to a student and you say, okay, what do you think about it? That's way too broad. That's way too broad, and that's going to be overwhelming, and it's likely that the feedback is not going to be very useful. Okay, so that's what I mentioned earlier. This process has to be gradual. You should start by simple reviewing tasks, or instead of a full essay, just maybe one paragraph. One paragraph, say, okay, let's focus on this, just to make sure that students understand what they are expected to do. So this could be you just focus on one paragraph, or you just focus on one assessment objective. Okay, let's just focus on the analysis, let's just focus on the knowledge and understanding, but overall the scope of the reviewing task has to be limited at first, very narrow, and then just once you have made sure that your students can do that, you can add more and more aspects of the in the reviewing, or more dimensions in the reviewing process, and then you gradually scale up one additional task or paragraph for each new assignment. Tip number 2, use examples. As I mentioned earlier, we all learn by through examples. So if you do not exemplify this process, if you do not show to everyone what they are expected to do with a very specific example, it might be difficult. Okay, so use examples during your lessons to illustrate this reviewing process. You can just do it, demonstrate it in front of your students several times. Okay, once is probably not going to be sufficient, to highlight the differences between helpful and unhelpful feedback. Okay, just for them to understand, say, okay, so this I should do, no, this I should avoid. Okay, so spend enough time. It is an investment. Student peer reviewing is definitely something that has a big fixed cost at the beginning of the year, but then that will eventually provide massive benefits if it becomes successful. Okay, but yes, it's going to take time at the beginning of the year to illustrate this process, to demonstrate it to the students. Tip number 3, provide scaffolding. Just again, don't abandon them. just make sure that you give clear instructions, clear expectations. Okay, if you give them like complete freedom, say, okay, give feedback on this essay, again, it's going to be unclear, and students might not really understand what to do step by step. So what you can do, and I think, Anton, you talked about that earlier, you talked about the handout or form, or a list of criteria, or set of instructions. So give to your students this type of handout that is going to help them to give the feedback. Okay, so with some grading or feedback criteria, or a list of things that they should screen or they should analyze in the essay. So with clear rules, review tasks, or questions you want them to answer about each other's work. You need to give them clear instruction. And actually, let me share something with you. The first time I tried to implement student peer reviewing, I designed this document. And this is a good example of what you should not do, in my opinion. And that's what I told you earlier, that when I tried to do it the first time, it was not very successful, because I did not introduce this process step by step. Okay, so I did try to provide some scaffolding, to provide some instructions, but I clearly introduced this process too fast. Students who had never done that before, and basically I wrongly expected them to be able to assess an entire essay. So, okay, that was my mistake. And I gave them something like that, where you see that you have different dimensions, different aspects of the essay that has to be assessed: the format, the knowledge, the keywords, the structure, the content, blah blah blah, and they had to mark from 1 to 5. So yeah, okay, at the end of the day, at the end of that process, once you have introduced every steps, or once you have completed every steps of the peer reviewing process, you could give them a similar type of assessment grid. But of course, if you just give this type of document to them at the very beginning, it's going to be overwhelming and they will not know exactly what they have to do. Okay, but at the end of the process, you could come up with something similar to that. Perhaps, Anton, you have something more elaborate, more and much more effective. Okay, let me go back to the PPT. Okay. Okay, so we were blah 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 blah. Provide scaffolding. Okay, establish a routine. It is something that making this process successful is something that is time consuming, and students have to build up these skills, these reviewing skills, and it does take time. So you need to establish a routine. So you can do that, I don't know, once a week, once every 2 weeks. You can allocate one lesson every 2 weeks that is dedicated to this reviewing process. And as I said, it is something that should really start early in the year. So in a few months, in 2-3 months, sometimes perhaps a bit more, students will be ready to implement this process and to give feedback to their students on a regular basis. So that's why I said earlier that I think it's still a bit late. It's now a bit late to start implementing this process for this academic year. But in August, in September, next academic year, this would be an ideal time to start building up those skills. And finally, I think that's the last one, tailor the process. Remember what we said, what I said earlier is that I do not implement peer reviewing for all my groups of students, because for some groups, I feel like this could really be effective, that they could really work together well, and that this could really provide great benefit. But for other groups of students, I am not that optimistic, and I feel like this would be a lot of time and energy used for an output that might not be very high. So yeah, tailor the process depending on the size and the dynamic of your group of students. You will need to decide whether students should do peer review in class or at home, work in pairs or in groups. There are many decisions that you need to make that process successful, that depend on many variables that are specific to your work environment. Okay, and okay, so these are five tips that again, mostly tips that I not really that I experienced myself, but things I learned from doing some research online on how to successfully implement student peer reviewing. Let me have a quick look at the chat box before moving on. So we are talking about English skills in the chat box. Many students can barely understand my lecture slide. Yeah, okay, but that's a problem, obviously. Yes, I know. I have some students like this who barely understand when I greet them at the beginning of the lesson. Okay, this happens. And yeah, it's difficult because there is not much you can do about that. So English ability is very different between schools. Yes, absolutely. And yeah, the sooner you start this building up those reviewing skills, the better. So if you have IGCSE students, you can definitely start in IGCSE. Again, gradually build it up, start with very simple reviewing tasks, and then you can add more and more criteria, more and more like to make the feedback more and more details as time goes by. And after in AS and A2, they will be fully ready to do that. And well, we've already talked about the benefits. Yes, Anton, I will allow you to share your screen. Let me just finish this presentation because there is not much left. I think there is just one last part, what to expect and how to respond. And then I will allow you to share your screen so you can show us some of the documents that you use or that you have created. Okay, let's just have a look at that. What to expect and how to respond. What if you have one student that tells you, hey, my partner's essay was so much better than mine, that I didn't feel like I could even help her. What would you respond to a student that would tell you something like that when you ask his or her to give feedback? How would you respond? Because of course this may happen. Anton said that later you can actually group students by ability. So this is something that should avoid this type of problem. But you also mentioned that at first you can allow friends to work together. So this is a potential issue that may arise. So what should you say in that case? Okay, likely a few points they can help. So let them know their strength. At least they can get help. Okay. And you can change grouping next week. Yes. Okay, Caitlin, I agree. First, it's true that if your friend's essay is much better, it's true you can learn from reading it, absolutely. But yeah, even if the essay is much better, you still have the possibility to to give a few comments, to make a few comments. And remember, what I often say this, that when I mark an essay, I usually pretend that I don't know anything about economics. And if there is something I can't understand, then there's probably something that has not been defined or not explained clearly or not illustrated properly. So even if you have a weaker student, it's fine if the essay is well written. Even a weaker student should be able to understand, or maybe not all of it, okay, but most of it, if the essay is sufficiently well written. So even this weaker student could start reading the essay, and as soon as he or she does not understand something, perhaps this indicates that, okay, there is a problem in the essay, because this doesn't make sense. Maybe your definition is missing, maybe your diagram is not explained, maybe the analysis is too superficial, okay? So even though you have different abilities within a group of students peer reviewing each other's work, you can still, both parties can still benefit from each other's feedback. Okay, how about this one? I didn't want to hurt my partner's feelings by telling his or her, oh, your essay is not good. How will you respond? How would you respond to that? Because yeah, especially if you make them work if you allow friends to work together, they might be reluctant to criticize, negatively each other's work. And they might just say, wow, you are amazing. Your essay is incredible. It's a possibility because yes, as I mentioned earlier, we never really like to be criticized. So what advices would you give to a student who would tell you, I didn't want to hurt my partner's feelings? My group mates feeling. Your students love to hurt each other, Anton. But yes, it needs to be clear from the beginning that feedback has to be positive and supportive, absolutely, and suggest improvement, which would help them. So write it in a way that helps them. Yes, okay. Criticizing does not negatively. Giving feedback when there is something that could be improved does not mean that you have to be aggressive about it, okay? You can just explain things in a very calm, positive, constructive way. And this way, there is no reason for which the feelings of the group mate are going to be hurt, okay? It all depends on how you make how you give your feedback, and how you, especially when there is something that could be improved, it always has to be constructive and kind, okay? So this is also something that has to be encouraged, and it's an important skill in life, okay? To criticize, but in a diplomatic way, in a way that will not be aggressive, in a way that is not going to hurt people's feelings. Number 3, there were so many mistakes, I did not know where to start. How would you respond to this type of concern? There are too many mistakes, I did not know where to start. Anton, you said the beginning. Yes. Okay. Good answer. But yeah, sometimes remember what I told you. If you give too much feedback, it can be overwhelming and it can discourage some students. If you give if you identify 30 or 40 different things that could be improved, it's overwhelming. So the yeah, okay, absolutely. What you feel is the most important. This is what we do as teachers, of course. So when there are too many mistakes, rather than identifying or pointing out all mistakes, we would tend to focus on the most important ones. It might be a bit difficult for students to do the same thing, because for some of them might struggle to identify what mistakes are the most significant and which ones are less significant. But as you said, Anton, just start by focusing on the mistakes that students feel are the most important. Absolutely. Yeah. So perhaps to overlook some tiny mistakes and to focus on those who really can have a very negative impact on the overall score of the student. Of course, according to the student's perception, what they feel, but if you have trained them well, that's why it's a gradual process. If you have trained them well, they should be able to recognize what mistakes are the most significant. Okay, so that's why you need to provide a lot of scaffolding, and you need to provide a lot of examples at the beginning of the year, so they are able to recognize the big mistakes and the tiny details. Yes, Katie, how to assign students in group. I think I have one thing about that later. Okay, and yes, as I told you, that this presentation that I made is not mostly the output of my research work. Well, research, okay, I spent one afternoon researching about it. Okay, that's not that's nothing very deep, but these are the references. If you want to have a look at the websites that I use to learn about how to implement student peer reviewing, these are the main sources of information that I have used to prepare this presentation. So you can have a look at the sources yourself. Anton, you wanted to share your screen to share some documents with us?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
You'll have to give me moderating powers or permission.
Just give me a second. All right, I'll make you co-host. Can you share your screen now?
Looks like. Yeah. Well, first thing I want to say is that this is the final product. So this is what I would be using really at the end of the year of A2. And as Sylvain has already mentioned before, it's a process. You'd almost want to start this in IG, where you start letting them pick from a multiple choice from what makes a good answer. Throughout those 3 years, you want them to learn, okay, what is good knowledge and understanding? How do you explain those parts well? What is good application? Already use example, go over their papers in class together. So again, when you see these documents, this is not the first thing I would give them or send to them, but this is the final part. So one of the things I've did is I've taken the assessment objectives also from the Cambridge papers, slightly changed the wording, slightly try to make a bit more clear what exactly it means, what exactly it is. So in a bit more detail, explaining what is analysis, what is evaluation, some suggestions to basically support them. And this is a document they would then put in their folder that they can always refer to refresh their memory. And as in the marking scheme, they usually just look at the question content part, what is required. I really explain to them from, okay, you need to look at these different assessment objectives. And in the beginning, just assign a level. So don't go for specific scores, just give specific levels for how well they believe knowledge and understanding, application, analysis, and evaluation were done. Lynn, you should be able to make it bigger. For me, it's full screen, so you should be able to double click on it to enlarge it. And I may be able to upload this one later as well. So this is one of the documents. Then, more importantly, at the center of it all is my goal sheet. So I've made a list of basically the main topics, the main large topics within A2. And students need to self-assess how well they believe they know these parts, partly self-assess, but most of them should start in unsure about certain topics. In order to move towards know most or know detailed, they need to prove that they know this by answering essay questions about these topics, and not just one question about one small part of the topic, but 2 or 3 questions covering most of the topic. And that brings us here. This is where they write their objectives. So here I've made some examples. They shouldn't have too many objectives open at a time. This student has 3 objectives they should be working on. How to explain and draw monopsony market, know the difference between GDP, NDP, national income, how to use the Gini correctly, and how to explain it well. And you can see for past objectives that it says a date and which question should prove that they have learned that. In order to show that they mastered a certain skill, which they had as an objective, there must be an essay in their folder, in this case with a certain question number, which demonstrates their skill. And of course, the same they use to show they learn a topic well. Then when the student has written their essay, someone else, of course, will have a look, will review it. So there's a reviewer, there's an author, and the first thing the author does before giving their essay and this paper to the reviewer is write down what are their main maximum 3 objectives they want to show, to prove using this essay. So those are written down. And then they can, the reviewer, the one who checked it, can say from, okay, yes, this objective was achieved or partially achieved, and then some comment later, or no, not achieved yet. The different assessment objectives are judged on level. Especially in the beginning, I don't want students to try to give a specific score yet. They won't know how to give the scores really. So in the beginning, I don't let them do that, but they can try to use that later on, really towards the final examination. There's an area where tips and suggestions are given. And of course, this is together with any writing that is already on the essay that they handed in. After getting this back, the question author also need to fill in from, hey, what did I learn from this review? Did I find any misconceptions? Are there any parts I need to study more? What did I do well now that was a problem before? So recognize indeed what progress has been made. And based on this feedback, they may add another objective. So the objective should also be based on the feedback from others. And you need others to help clear and to say you achieved a part or not. Then there is one more part. Let me find it. Now, this one I don't use so often, and I think it was Caitlin that also talked about this topic. When you are reviewing someone's question, you are also learning. You are seeing what they do well, what didn't they do well. So this form would help support those who have reviewed from, hey, did this person that you helped review, did they have goals that you also have in common? So which, did you have any trouble marking this topic? If this was difficult, then yeah, you have to study it. Or you may need to spend more time on learning more about this topic as well. What strengths did you see that you think you can incorporate? And of course, what weaknesses and any other things that you have learned. I don't expect them to always fill this in because it's too much work, but I want them to know it exists. And for some, it can be useful at times. I do suggest it. But yeah, it shows what Caitlin said, that even from marking someone's paper, you can learn. And the last one, what is important is that I need to assess, of course, progress of students. And I do this by observing, by taking a look at their folders to see how many essays they've written, how many reviews they've given. I can see who reviewed their paper, so I can say from, okay, those people are reviewing well. There are simple things like exit slips you can use as well to help track progress. Because progress is the most important. It doesn't matter if someone is evaluated with level 1s or level 4s. Key is that they make progress, that they are trying. So that is what I need to check and what I need to get feedback on. Because yeah, it's all about improvement, not about current ability. It's the progress and ability that matters. So yeah, this was for the final part. Any question regarding these? Let me see.
Hey, Anton, would you mind sharing those documents? I mean, like
yeah, I can throw them in the group.
Is it okay? So you.
So of course, some of them are based on Cambridge. Of course, the assessment objectives. I take the Cambridge ones and I translate them into a more usable English and add a few examples from here and there. So of course, some of it is not purely mine, and some of it is. So, yeah, no problem.
Thank you very much.
Again, your students need the right ability in order to do that, and this is basically the last step I would try to work towards and let them work with. And again, it doesn't work for everyone, also English ability-wise, but it does work for the higher ability students, and yeah, that does give you time for more. Yeah, command words, all those things are of course useful, and they have a folder with different segments. One is really aimed towards learning essay writing, where this goes into, and yeah, command words also would go there. So make sure it is structured and ordered for them who really need it. There are a few students who don't like to work with structure, or if they do well without it, I may let them off the hook, but they do need to review other papers. I do need to see their name on that they reviewed. Command words are very important. The problem is that sometimes Cambridge is not always consistent with command words. And sometimes when we use questions from past papers, they use those differently than they would now. So that's the only problem with command words. But yeah, I'll share these. And if you have any questions, let me or Sylvain know.
Thank you so much, Anton, for sharing this. I think we all find it extremely useful because as I mentioned, I have not acquired a lot of experience using peer reviewing with my students. So the presentation I made was mostly from research, but not from experience. And I was not able to provide examples of documents you can actually give to your students to support this process. So thank you for sharing and illustrating what type of documents you can use to make that process successful. This is really something for my own professional development. This is really something that I want to implement in my classroom. I've been quite busy doing other things, so that's maybe why I have not yet done it. But I am really convinced that this can be a very powerful instrument that can support you and your students and help them to achieve a higher score and to perform better if it is implemented properly. I think I have learned from my previous mistakes. The fact that we have shared about how to do it successfully should allow everyone to do it properly. If you guys want to give it a shot, perhaps for next academic year. Does anybody want to ask Anton or me or anyone else other questions about student peer reviewing?
Yes, Doctor, you discussed in the peer reviewing presentation that we can discuss the students' work in front of like other students. So does it has any problem maybe if some students are not comfortable that their weaknesses are shown in front of others?
Well, you don't have to indicate who wrote the essay first. You don't have to show the name. You can remove the name or make sure that it is not displayed on the screen. If you are concerned that a student might feel uncomfortable, well, first you can just ask the student in advance, do you mind if I use your work to illustrate this and this? And you can also pick work from students will not be upset by the fact that you use their work to illustrate a good practice, because they might feel very comfortable if you use their work to illustrate a good practice, right? But yeah, if you want to be safe, if you feel like there might be a problem, well, the best solution is just to ask their permission in advance. Say, okay, would you mind if I do it? And in most cases, the answer will be no problem. So, but yeah, that's how I would approach it.
Sorry, because I commonly use the students' own work to evaluate together. Besides that they notice, I always remove the name. So after an examination, when the papers are still in good condition before I mark them, I throw them all in the scanner, the printing machine scanner. Basically, it makes a scan of all papers. I don't do anything with that yet. Then at that point, then I go mark the papers. From that, I know which ones I would like to use later on. Then I open those sections, edit to remove the student's name and information. And then I can use those, both the before and after marking version if I want. And again, without the students' names, usually that is okay. Sometimes I know it's going to be obvious which student it was. For one, I don't show the terribly bad ones where we know which student it was. And if I know this is from a very good student and everyone immediately knows it must be this one because it's so good, then I do talk to that student in advance and say from, hey, this could be very useful to help your classmates. So hope you don't mind if I show it in class and also in the other class. And usually that's okay. So yeah.
And yeah,
but it really helped me that I scanned them in advance before I start marking, because after I start marking, it becomes a bit of a mess. And then it's difficult to ask students to give their feedback on it because it already has my feedback on it. So that's why I pre-scan. Sorry, Sylvain.
No, it's fine. I just wanted to add, and in any event, the very bad essays, usually you can't really learn anything interesting from them. So these are usually not the essays that I would pick to illustrate something. Like those very, very, very weak essays where there is not much. It's usually not super instructive for the other students anyway. But yeah, talk to your students in advance if they if there is a risk of them feeling uncomfortable with you using their work in front of everyone.
Doctor, you're in mute.
Yeah, I can't hear
Thank
your voice,
you, thank
Dr.
you,
Chu.
thank you, thank you, thank you very much. Yeah, I forgot to unmute my mic. Okay, I was saying, I'm not sure where I started. I was saying that in any event, the very weak essays usually are not quite instructive. Okay, if there is an essay where there is almost nothing or too many mistakes, it's really difficult. There's not much you can learn from this essay. So this is usually not the essays that I would pick to illustrate something to my class. Yeah. But yeah, if there is a risk of students feeling uncomfortable with you using their essays in front of everyone, it's just ask the student in advance. So I was suggesting that I think we are ready to move on to the next topic. So our two first topics were probably the most important ones today. Because we talked about command words a few minutes ago, I suggest we have a look at a very short topic, which is called how to choose which essay question to answer. Because I noticed, you should be able to see my screen now, because I noticed that usually students, they choose what essay question to answer in just a few seconds, right? 2 or 3 seconds, they see, oh, inflation or unemployment, and boom, they start writing. And I have always been very scared when seeing that students start writing just 1 minute or not even 30 seconds after the papers have been released. I think it is an important decision. So in AS right now, you know that the syllabus will change next year, but at the moment they have to choose 1 essay question out of 3, and in A2, 2 out of 6. It is a decision that should not be rushed, and rushing this decision can have very severe, very severe consequences. So there are some criteria that should be considered when choosing what essay question to answer. And this is definitely not a decision that should be rushed. So why rushed? Why is it an important decision? Okay, so in AS, we have basically 1 out of 3, 2 out of 6. And well, choosing is refusing. So if I choose, there is an opportunity cost. If I choose one, I will not do the other. Obviously, we all know that here. And yeah, it's an important decision that should not be rushed, and we should take up to a few minutes. Of course, we should not take 20 minutes to think about it, but to take enough time, at least it depends on students, it depends on the questions, but students should make sure that they spend enough time considering or reading each essay question and making the best possible decision. So what if this decision is being rushed? What if students choose an essay question too fast? And most of them do, actually. Risk number 1, if they start writing, if they choose, if they read the essay question too fast and they start writing too fast, the risk number 1 is that they will not answer the question, okay? Because they often work by keywords. Yeah, they see a labor market, a price control, protectionism, and boom, they will not really carefully consider what the question is about and what content should be included, and they will start answering right away, writing everything they know about the topic, and at the end of the day, they might simply not answer the question. So that's a pretty big deal. Risk number 2, going off topic, which of course it's related. Again, if the students, they start answering too fast, they might include some content that is simply not relevant to the essay question. So that's why it's necessary to take sufficient time to read the questions in detail. Or the opposite, we might include some content that is not relevant, or we might overlook some important points. Again, if you do not read the essay question sufficiently well, if you do not really understand what content is being tested and what is relevant, there are several concepts that would be relevant that may be overlooked. Risk number 4, students ending up being unable to find examples or to make some interesting evaluative comments. They choose one essay question because they feel confident about the concept, but once they have to give examples, they realize that actually I don't have anything that would be relevant to illustrate that point, or as soon as they make an argument, they can't think of any good evaluative comment to make. So of course, this is part of the planning process of the essay, but before students start writing or even start planning, they have to consider for each possible essay question what arguments they would make, what examples they would use, what evaluative comments they would make, what keywords they would be able to define. So essentially, for each essay question, when they consider which one to answer, they very quickly, just in their mind, they have to ask themselves, would I be able to demonstrate all 4 assessment criteria? Okay, otherwise I will not be able to achieve the highest possible grade. Okay, do I know the concepts? Do I have examples? Do I have good points to make? Do I have evaluative comments to make as well? The risk number 5 is to write a one-sided or an unbalanced essay, where you have a discuss essay, where you often have to look at the pros of something, the cons of something, or one side of the argument, the other side of the argument. Students might know a lot or have many things to say in one part. And when they start thinking about, what can I write in the other part to bring balance in my essay, they might realize that, I don't have anything to say. And of course, that is a very serious issue. So before choosing the essay question, they should consider whether they will be able to write a balanced essay. So that's mostly for discuss or essays that require an evaluation, where they have to consider 2 parts. Do they have enough content on both parts so they can write a balanced essay? And risk number 6 would be to change horses in midstream. You know that when students, they start writing an essay, and after a few lines, they change their minds, say, maybe that's not the best essay question. They cross everything and they choose another essay question. It's a problem because they waste time, of course, and so it can negatively affect their confidence. This can make them panic a bit. So that's why it is much safer to take enough time to consider all the consequences of choosing one essay question, and to make sure that they will be able to demonstrate all assessment criteria. Okay, so what are the selection criteria? That's essentially how to limit the risk or to avoid the risks that I have mentioned earlier. What should students think about when choosing the essay question? So of course, the step 1 is to read each essay question carefully, okay? Not just looking at the keywords, the concept, but really to look at each essay question carefully, the key concepts, the command words, the specific instructions, like using examples or using a diagram, because sometimes students forget to use a diagram, forget to use examples. So that's definitely a problem. To think about which content is being tested. Okay, do I understand what this essay question is about? Do you understand what part of the syllabus or what parts of the syllabus would be relevant to this essay question? And then what are the several selection criteria? And I usually like to put them in terms of questions that students should ask themselves, again, very quickly. They don't have to write anything, but in their mind, before when they consider whether or not to answer an essay question. Do I feel confident about my subject knowledge of the content related to this essay question? Of course, that's obvious. And usually this single question will allow them to eliminate 1, 2, or 3 essay questions, depending on whether we are doing AS or A2. There are some topics that students really don't like, okay? So perhaps this question can eliminate those essay questions. Do I clearly understand both parts of the question? So both parts if it's part A, part B, because sometimes you have students who write very good part A,
but a terrible part B. That happens perhaps because they have put too much focus on part A. They felt very confident about part A, and they just didn't realize that, okay, part B was more challenging, that they did not really understand it. Can I think of sufficient arguments to put forward in each part? Do I have enough things to say? And can I write a balanced essay? Can I think of good examples to support my main points? Okay, in each part. I have anything that comes to my mind when I think about this argument? Will I have an opportunity to use diagrams? At least one. Using diagrams is a skill, and every essay question should have at least one. Okay, often several, but at least one. So we should always think about, okay, for this essay question, what diagram can I use? Can I think of interesting evaluative comments to make? So this list of questions, and again, this is not really something that's really something that should go very quickly. And of course, some essay questions can be eliminated rather quickly. But if a student hesitates between, let's say, two essay questions, going through these questions or asking themselves these questions should really help them to make the best possible decision and to go for the essay question that will allow them to achieve the highest possible score. So I really think that this is something that should not be overlooked at the beginning of an examination, and they should not rush this type of decision. They should definitely make sure that they have considered all the consequences of choosing one essay question over another. Okay, and you see, that's it. That's a very short topic, but I think it's important, and I think it's something that we don't really discuss with students, or we never really give clear advices or guidelines. So these are the guidelines that I give my students to make sure that they don't rush this decision and that they choose the essay question that best match their skills. Okay, let me have a look at the Antonio said often they crossed work with worth more point than their new horse. Okay, risk number 7. That's also a possibility. We often, in French, there is a say that goes, the first idea is often the best. So if we have started with one essay question, perhaps we should not change our minds halfway through. Okay, would anyone like to add something about this process of choosing an essay question? Do you have any, do you yourself have any questions about this, or would you like to add anything? All good?
Professor, we had a separate session on the diagrams.
Yes.
Yesterday you were saying that, okay. Yeah, I'm waiting for that.
Eve, you raised your hand?
Yeah, can I ask a quick and simple question? So saying like students, they are giving options to choose from a range of topics, right? So what if like option A is a student will find it to be easier, or the topic is more familiar, while option B is harder, or this is like a new topic that they've never written before. So for option A, student will assume that a lot of other candidates, a lot of other test takers will take this option. So the examiner will like be harder on them. Well, you know what I mean? But for the option B, because it's a new topic, it seems harder. So they assume that examiner will go easier on them. Is that true? Or, you know, the examiner just grade based on the mark scheme?
That
Or
sounds,
like,
yeah, go
grade,
ahead.
like the curve the grade.
That sounds like game theory, right?
Yeah.
Oh, what you say makes total sense. You know that the grade thresholds, they depend on performance of candidates. And it's true that especially because the mark schemes are not very precise and they still leave a lot of room for interpretation, especially for part B. If you have a part A that is very easy, so most students do well, I don't think I don't see a reason for which the examiner is going to be tougher. Who knows, maybe, but especially for part B. For part B, it's much more challenging, and you have 90% of students who do not do really well, and then 10% who do particularly well. It is true that those students who have done well can perform much better and have a much higher grade than everybody else, because their work is going to stand out, and the examiner will, again, these are just assumptions, it's difficult to tell, might reward these the 10% that have really written a good answer to part B. But it's honestly, I don't have, you said this is a very simple question. No, it's not a very simple question. It's difficult to tell. It's really difficult to tell. But obviously, my point is that it's probably not a good idea to choose an essay question if we only know part A well, not part B. Of course, it depends on what are the alternatives. If that's the best you can do, if you don't understand any of the other questions, then that's probably the best. But my point is that sometimes I really feel like students, they just look at part A and say, oh yeah, that's amazing, I know that. And they will just go ahead with this essay question without really considering that half of the essay question is not going to be very good if they don't understand part B, or if they don't have a lot of interesting things to say about part B. Yeah, so that's sometimes the feeling I have. So that's why what you can do, again, I think I mentioned that yesterday, is when they take in-class exercises, not mock exams, but like a monthly test, practice test, give them the question paper, and then you give them the answer sheets 2 or 3 minutes later. So for the 2 or 3 first minutes, they have nothing else to do than to choose the essay question. So just to force them to allocate sufficient time to making that decision. Angela, you say you should not play games with examiner. It's not really about playing games. It's just trying to understand what can happen in their minds, because examiners are human beings, and we have human psychology that is actually quite predictable. Of course, there are some individual characteristics, but we have also things in common. So there are some, and I'll talk about this a bit later when talking about diagrams, the format of the essay, and so on. There are some things we can do to make sure the examiner is in a good, has a good perception of your work, and is more likely to award the highest possible grade to your students. Anton, you raised your hand?
Yeah, on the specific case, I would say don't risk it. But normally for helping students to deal with questions and what they need to do for questions, when I already start group work in the middle of the year, the group, before they take the essay question home to answer, they must write down what they expect they need to do and discuss that with the other group members. So they have to analyze and evaluate what needs to be done for the question. And then after they finish writing the essay, when they get the marking sheet, before they start marking their essay, they must first compare their assumptions about the questions with the marking sheet and feedback on that. So it's really an important part of the process.
Thank you, Anton. Yeah, absolutely. sharing with classmates about, like, in advance, discussing about what they exchanging ideas on what they believe the content, what content could be included, and so on, can definitely be useful before they start writing. Because yeah, you know that we have many students who simply do not answer the question, perhaps because they have read it too quickly, or because they have not taken enough time to think about, all right, what content is relevant, which one is not, and also because some of them, they simply have this wrong assumption that if I write everything I know about the topic, well, then I should be fine. Absolutely not. So this is really something that it's a practice that they really have to abandon. They should never do such a thing. That's not going to pay off. They will not obtain a high grade if they do not provide a clear and specific answer to the essay question. Okay. There are two more topics. Let's just do two more topics today because they are relatively quick, and then we will have two very short topics left that have to do with writing skills. So let's just, for tomorrow, let's say how to support non-native English speakers, very quick, and how to use transitional words and phrases, that's also rather quick. And today, to conclude this today's workshop, let's have a look at the format of the essays, so the presentation of the essays, and the use of diagrams. I am very fond of diagrams, and there are many tips that you can give to your students to make sure that they use diagrams properly. But let's start with how to format an essay. So how to make sure that the presentation of your essay is as good as possible. All right. Beautiful handwriting, right? So first, why does presentation matter? Because okay, this is not an art class. So at the end of the day, we could consider that the presentation does not matter as long as the content is valid, right? But you know that this is not true. Presentation does matter. The presentation of an essay will have an influence on the final grade, whether it is fair or not. Even though on paper, if you look at the syllabus, I don't think there is anything in the syllabus about the presentation of the work. I don't think there is anything that says that, oh, even if the presentation is bad, some points are going to be subtracted. But that being said, it is more likely if you take two essays that are absolutely identical in terms of their content, and one has a very good presentation and one has a very bad presentation, do you really think that they are going to obtain the same grade? It's quite unlikely. And it's likely that the better presented essay will obtain a higher grade. Why? Why does presentation matter? And the presentation should never be overlooked. A poor presentation does create a visual discomfort, which makes grading more tedious. We have all experienced that. Students who have a very bad handwriting or the diagrams that are extremely poor, well, we will look at the different reasons for which an essay can be poorly presented. But basically, it is really not comfortable to read, to mark an essay. A poor presentation is also a bad signal that the student sends to the examiner. It basically means that the student does not apply himself or herself, does not pay enough attention to the work, or that the student was rushed, did not manage his or her time properly. It's a bad signal that is sent to the examiner. And at the end of the day, because we could say, okay, so what? That's too bad for the examiner, but that's not my problem as a student. No, because it is, whether we like it or not, this is going to have a negative influence on the examiner's perception of the student's work. And eventually, this may lead to a lower grade. Is this fair? Maybe not, because again, if you look at the mark schemes, if you look at the assessment criteria, there is nothing about the presentation. But again, this is simply human psychology. If you struggle to read an essay, if all of your attention is used to try to read the words, to analyze the diagram, because it is too small, even if the content, even if the analysis is good, it's going to be very painful to mark the essay. And the likelihood that you will give a high grade to this essay is going to be much lower. Whether we like it or not, whether it is fair or not, it's just a fact, it's just true. So let's avoid that. Let's just try to make the examiner's work as easy as possible. Let's try to make to make sure the presentation of our essay is as good as possible. It is also a form of respect. Okay, we respect the work of the examiner. We try to make sure that it is as comfortable as possible. I have never worked as a Cambridge examiner because I have other things to do during my summer holiday. And I don't think the pay is high enough for this very tough job. It's a very tough job to mark essays. But I know that in most cases, they have to mark several hundreds of essays. And of course, it is not the most exciting job in the world. So we want, as a student, we want to make this job as easy as possible. And through presentation, we can achieve that. We can make sure that the examiner's perception of the student's work is as good as possible. So what are the key ingredients? Of course, number one, handwriting. Not too small, has to be neat, has to be Roman, so like separate letters, okay? Block script, okay, so standard writing, okay? These are the handwriting has to be as clear as possible. Erasures, sometimes I have students, they erase one sentence out of 2 or one word out of 4 because they don't really think before writing. They start a sentence and then they change their mind. So I often tell them, before you write a sentence, first you run it in your mind, okay, until you are happy with the sentence that you are about to write. And okay, once you are happy with your sentence, you write it. But you have to think before you write. Otherwise, you're going to just erase so many things. And again, it looks very awkward. And it is, again, a bad signal. It basically means that, oh, this student is not very confident about what he or she is writing. Is always erasing things. It's a bad signal sent to the examiner. So yeah, think before you start writing. Margin, so that's not really for the Cambridge examination, but more for work. We often have margins for us teachers to write some comments, and sometimes we have students writing in the margins or adding diagrams. Of course, it's definitely not something they are not meant for students to use. So make sure that students, they write where they are supposed to write, that they don't use the margins, obviously. Paragraphs. Oh, this is what I am really struggling with. Many students, they don't use paragraphs. So it's just going to be one block per page. It is not very comfortable to read because the structure is very hard to identify. Okay. On the other hand, if you have one paragraph per argument or even one paragraph per part, that just makes it more clear. Okay, we understand once a line is skipped, okay, we have finished something and we are about to start something new. Okay, so you skip a line and you start writing not to the extreme left, but I think we call it indentation. Okay, when you just leave some space on the line before you start writing. It's just a common way to makes it easier for the reader to understand the structure of your essay, to make the structure more explicit. Okay, you should fight your students if they do not use paragraphs. Okay, and diagrams, of course, this is what I call topic 3. That we have a dedicated session about how to use diagrams. So These are the key ingredients. Maybe I overlooked some. I'll see in the chat box if you can think of anything else that can have an influence on the presentation of the essay, please type it in the chat box. But to me, these are the main things, the main elements of a good presentation. All right. So now let's do a little game. I have selected some work from my students, and your job is to tell me if the presentation is good, if it's bad, and how it could be improved. Okay. Let's see. How about this one? What do you think about the presentation of this essay?
The handwriting is not, the Y's are quite unfriendly for the examiner's eye. And yeah, the presentation is terrible. You know, that's the least I can say that.
Yeah, it's not amazing. Okay, yes. What else is you see that when you have something like that, do you want to read it? Honestly, I don't. I really don't want to read that. And I don't even know the content. Maybe it's an amazing essay. Maybe it would be an A-star essay. But even before I start reading, I don't want to read it. And I already have a negative impression. So you see, that's something that's going to be difficult to offset. What else? Right. What else is wrong about this? Okay, no space for comments. Yes. So of course, if this was the Cambridge examination, this would not be a big deal. But yes, you see that there is no margin whatsoever. The handwriting is not amazing. It's not terrible. I have seen much worse. I can read that, but it's not amazing. No paragraphs, or maybe is this a paragraph at the bottom, but you see that there is no line being skipped to move from one paragraph to the other. So yeah, that's not a good example. No margins, no clear paragraph. The handwriting is really so not amazing in terms of presentation. So yeah, I agree, it should be divided into more paragraphs. Example number 2. How about this one? You think it's okay? Is there anything that we could improve?
Yeah, the thing I like, they wrote it in the paragraphs form, and the writing is not so good, but it is readable. You know, at least we can read something. But
okay,
it's
yes.
not the,
so
it's not very good.
You see that indeed there are some paragraphs, even though no lines have been skipped. It's I like it much better when one line is skipped and there is no indentation. You see, like we should start writing maybe here or there just to make the paragraph more explicit. Something that I really don't like is that you see this diagram, there is text wrapped around it. I really don't like this. For a clear presentation, students should never write anything besides their diagram. The diagram, we'll talk about that in a minute. The diagram should be centered and they should not be anything on the left or on the right. And because the diagram should be large enough, you should not even have space anyway to write anything besides it. Okay, so it's not terrible, but it's definitely not great. I honestly don't remember why the student has used the landscape presentation of the paper, but yeah, that's definitely not amazing. How about this one?
Very tiny font, not readable. Yeah, I can't read anything actually. Although the paragraphs are there, the proper indentation has been used, but again, you know, the writing is very small, you know.
Yeah, the writing is very small indeed. That makes it harder to read. There are a lot of erasures. There is an entire diagram that is crossed. You see there is an erasure here, there, 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 here. There are so many erasures. And again, I don't know if this work is good or not in terms of the content, but when I look at this page, I already have a rather negative impression about this work. And that's really what you want to avoid. What you want to achieve is that when the examiner opens the paper and looks at the essay, say, ah, that looks good. You see, just to put the examiner in a positive mood, or to start with a good impression when reading the essay. So yeah, this one, the paragraph, again, there is an indentation here, but no line has been skipped, but okay, that's not such a big deal here. But yeah, the diagrams are not very good. We'll talk about that again in a minute. How about this one?
Yeah, the writing is very good, but the presentation is not so good. You know, no paragraphs, just written. There are some of the erasures, but they are, since they are readable, so not so unfriendly for the eyes. Professor, actually, I had to ask about this diagram style, because most of the students follow this style. You know, they made the diagram and then they write, you know, half of the lines in front. So do you personally recommend this style, or you want the diagrams separate on the new lines?
I really don't like, but okay, maybe that's just my personal preferences. But I really don't like this type of presentation for diagrams. When you have the diagram and then on the right, for example, you have text. You see here, there is clearly a problem where the diagram is way too close to the text, especially over here. There should be sufficient space between the text and the diagram. And the problem is that often if you allow students to do that, their diagrams are going to be way too small, because they are only going to use half of the page width to draw their diagrams. Depending on how complex the diagram is, this can really make it difficult to read. And I just like diagrams to be big enough, large enough, centered at the center of the page, and with nothing beside it. When I wrote my master's thesis and my PhD, this was the rule. Okay, you put your diagrams in the middle, large enough, nothing besides it, and that's, I believe, for what I learned at university, this is the standard way to write an academic paper. So yeah, sometimes if you read the newspapers, they have a different presentation and they would wrap text around graphs, diagrams. But in academic writing, I really don't believe this is a proper practice. I will show you what I think is a much better practice. So for this one, yeah, the handwriting is pretty good. There are no paragraphs though, no paragraphs. So that's, again, makes it a bit heavy when we see something like that. Not so many erasures. Okay, so yes, they are 2, 3, 4. That's still too many, but that's okay. And here you see the student has used the margin. Okay, it's no big deal. It's a tiny detail, but this is something that should be avoided. All right. Okay, that's not terrible. That's not, but there are things, there are ways in which we could improve the presentation. The main thing here is really this, the way this diagram is used here. I don't think it's a proper practice. How about this one? Presentation only.
Yeah, presentation is good. Proper line spacing has been used after the end of the paragraph. Indentation has been used. There are no more, we can say, erasures. Writing is also like eyes friendly, so I can read well. Yeah, so what is good.
Yeah, to me, that's okay. Of course, there are a few things we could improve. There are a few erasures. Okay, here you see there is not much of a margin, but overall, I think we agree that that is pretty good. Okay, clear paragraphs, clear handwriting, not that many erasures. When we see something like that, and again, even before we start reading, we already have a positive impression about this work, and that's what we want to achieve. I think that's the last one, is it? Yeah. All right, that is the last one. Yeah. Well, the content, I haven't read the content. Okay, for now let's just focus on how it looks, because look matters. Yes. So yeah, okay, if you compare this and this, or this, or even this, regardless of the content, and I don't even know what it is, I am inclined to believe that this is going to be better. And again, that's just based on how it looks. Is it a wrong assumption, or are we wrong when making that assumption? Not really, because what does it mean? When you have a paper or an essay that looks good, it means that we are dealing with a student who basically applies himself or herself, pays attention to the presentation. And that can be, sorry guys, there is a mic that is echoing. And that is something that can give information about what to expect in terms of the quality of the content. This can be deceiving, okay, but in most cases, it's actually going to be a reliable information. Okay, does anybody want to add anything about the presentation of essays? Did I forget to mention anything about how to make sure that the essay is presented the best possible way? Yes, the use of transitional words at the beginning of each paragraph makes it more clear. So we will have tomorrow a dedicated session on how to use transitional words properly. You see, however, in conclusion, also, second, you see that student therefore uses a lot of transitional words that make it easier to follow the train of thought. And we will talk about this tomorrow. So it's not really about the presentation, it's more about the writing skill. But yeah, overall, I think if all of our students could do something like that, we would be very happy. All right, let's have a quick look at the last one we will do today, how to use diagrams. All right. This is a presentation that I have already made in the past on several occasions. I think there is even a YouTube video on my channel about how to use diagrams in economics. You may know that I have already even started to write a textbook, an economics textbook that is based on diagrams. I have shared a sample on the website. But yeah, diagrams are extremely important in economics. And as I said earlier, for every essay question, students should use at least one diagram. I don't think there is any essay question where no diagrams can be used. There is always one, at least, diagram that could be relevant. Why is it important? Why should we, well, students, use diagrams? There are actually several reasons. Reason number one, because diagrams can be used to support an explanation or to illustrate. Okay, so to illustrate something, diagrams can be used as an example. I talked about that when we discussed the assessment objectives. If you make a point about negative externalities and you explain that the market fails when there is a negative externality, you can use a diagram to support your explanation. If you explain why it means to have two goods in joint supply, you can have side-by-side diagrams where you would show the markets for beef and the market for leather, for example. Okay, so diagrams can be there to support an explanation or to illustrate a point that you have previously explained before. Reason number two, you know that we often say that one picture is worth 1,000 words. The idea here is that when we look at a diagram, in less than a second, there is so much information that we receive. If I show you any diagram, again, let's do an experiment. Are you ready for the experiment? I'm going to show you a diagram for just 1 second and try to think about how much information you have acquired. I'm going to give you 3 seconds. That's the textbook I started to write about diagrams. So I'm going to show you a random diagram. I'm going to give you 3 seconds and you will see how much information, the massive amount of information that you have received just by looking at the diagram for 3 seconds. Are you ready? Okay, I'll just go randomly to not one that is too hard. Okay, boom, this one. 1, 2, 3, boom. And you see in only 3 seconds, you know exactly that, okay, so this is a diagram that shows how the price elasticity of demand will decrease as we go down along a demand curve that is represented as a straight line from perfectly price elastic to perfectly price inelastic. At the middle point of this demand curve, we have a unit price elasticity of demand. You see, in only 3 seconds, there is a massive amount of information that we have received just by looking at this diagram. And now imagine if you wanted to explain all that by text, by writing. Imagine how many sentences you would have to write, and imagine the time that it would take to read all of these sentences. So my point here is that using diagram is a very effective way to communicate, because when you write an essay, it's nothing but a form of communication between a student and an examiner or teacher, okay? And by using diagram, you can be very concise. You can transmit information and demonstrate knowledge very effectively, much more effectively than if you had instead written everything. So that's one reason for which you should use diagrams. Reason number 3, because using diagrams is a skill. It's a skill, even though it's not mentioned as an assessment objective, but it's a tool, it's an instrument that we can use to demonstrate knowledge and understanding, analysis, evaluation, and actually all assessment objectives can be demonstrated by using a diagram, okay? So yeah, it's an integral part of the economist's toolbox. It's a tool that we have to use, and students should just show that they are able to use diagrams properly when writing an essay. And reason number 4, so this is not really for when we write, especially for MCQs, for example. So that's not really for essay writing, but if there is a multiple choice question and we don't really know what the answer is, very often if you graph it, if you graph the diagram on a draft, on a piece of paper, this is going to help you to find what the right answer is. So yeah, when in doubt, graph it, and graphing it often helps to find what the right answer is. So you see at least 4 reasons for which students should use diagrams. Okay, so now how to use diagrams like a pro. That's also a document that I have shared. Let me try to show it with you, because this PPT is not very detailed, but at the beginning of my textbook, I have made a list of 15 tips, 15 tips to use diagrams like a pro. So you have every tip that is explained, where I explain why it matters to do that. And you also have tips that are specifically for teachers. I think the 2 last advices, yes, the 2 last advices are for teachers. So I'm not going to go through this document because this would be too long. This document can be found on the website. Okay, I have shared it. I usually print it for my students at the beginning of the year. I have also shared this document, the Secrets of Economics Diagram, which is the sample of the textbook I am writing about diagrams. And the idea is to have different modules, and for each module you have 1 diagram, and each diagram is explained in detail. Okay, so that's for AS and A2 and even IGCSE actually. I am not yet finished with this project, but yeah, that's really something that I will work on as soon as I have some time. Okay, but let's just stick to the PPT for now. All right, so how to use diagrams? Well, of course, do not use colors, because you know that when the essays are scanned, they are often scanned in black and white. So if you write something like, oh, look at the blue curve, or look at the red curve, is going to be confusing, but usually students don't use colors. Okay, so I just started with this, but that's usually not a significant issue. One of the biggest mistake, or I should say it's a big mistake because their diagrams are often too small. It's often the case, right, where they will draw diagrams that are too small, and if the diagram is complex enough, think about the diagram in A2 about price effect, substitution effect, income effect. It's not a very simple diagram, and if it's too small, it's going to be very difficult to graph it properly, and for the examiner, it's going to be very difficult to analyze it and to assess it properly. So the scale of the diagram should be appropriate, not too small, of course, not too big, but usually the problem students have is that they draw diagrams that are definitely too small. I'll show you what I call an appropriate scale. Something else, I mentioned it earlier, students should always leave some space between the diagram and the text, okay, at least one line above the diagram and one line below the diagram. Again, this has to do with the presentation of your work. If the text is too close to the diagram, it's not going to be comfortable to read. Ideally, it's okay if students don't do that, but I like it when students give at least a number. Something like figure 1. Then the title, I like it when there is a title, but it's okay if students don't give a title to their diagrams. Okay, why is it useful to give a number? This is particularly useful when several diagrams will be used in the essay. Let's say you have 3 diagrams, and then later in your essay, you want to refer to one of them. How can you refer to one of your diagrams if they don't have numbers? On the other hand, if you write figure 1, figure 2, figure 3 below each of your diagram, and if you want to refer to one of them later in your essay, you can simply say as displayed or as we saw in figure 2, and then that makes it very clear what diagram you are talking about. Because if you just write as we saw in the diagram before, but we don't know which diagram you are talking about. Okay, so a number makes it much easier to connect your diagram with your explanation. I like it when there is a title because it gives some context. It just gives information to the reader about what there is to see in the diagram. What does the student want to illustrate in this diagram? Okay, so a brief title, something like yes, indirect taxation and deadweight loss, just to introduce, okay, this is what my diagram shows. It just usually helps to better understand what there is to see in that diagram. So at least a number, and if possible, a title. Obviously, students should always use a ruler to draw straight lines. So the axis, a straight demand curve or straight supply curve, or anything that is a straight line has to be drawn with a ruler. Again, this has to do with the presentation of the work, always. It is definitely not a good practice to start answering an essay question with a diagram. Some students do that, but it doesn't make any sense because, again, a diagram is there to support something, either to support an explanation or to give an example or to illustrate something. So if you start your answer with a diagram, it doesn't make any sense because you have not explained anything. So you can't support anything with a diagram, and there is nothing to illustrate. Okay, so remember that the diagram should always come after one of your explanation, never before. What else? As I said, for the presentation of your work, the diagram should be centered, yes, and nothing should be written besides it. And in any event, if the diagram is large enough, students should not have enough space on the sides to write much content. Of course, everything has to be labeled, okay? All axes, all curves. For some reason, you'll tell me if you face the same problem. For some reason, their students, they always forget to label one curve. Do you know which one? Let's see if we have the same problem. There is one curve that students often, not always, often forget to label. Which one is it? Which curve am I thinking about? Let's see if you can find it. One curve that students often forget to label. They always label supply, they always label demand, but which one do they often forget to label? No idea? Well, maybe these are just my students then. I noted that students often forget to label the PPC. Yeah, absolutely, Caitlin, the PPC, especially if they represent it as a curve, not as a straight line. For some reason, pay attention to this next time, but many students, they don't label it. Maybe because it has this shape and they don't consider that it is a curve. I don't know, but they very often forget to label it. So that's a mistake. Make sure you fix it. Use arrows to show movement. Yeah, sometimes you have an initial situation and then something changes, demand increases, something like that. Using arrows helps to emphasize what is the initial situation, what is the final situation, what is the initial equilibrium, what is the final equilibrium. So anytime a curve shifts, there should be an arrow to show this shift. And also, as soon as a value changes on an axis, could be the horizontal axis or the vertical axis, you should have an arrow from the initial value to the final value. Again, just to make it more clear, what is the initial value, what is the final value. So arrows not only between curves that shift, but also along the axis when a value changes. It could be an increase in price, could be an increase in quantity, okay? Arrows will help, will make it easier to read, to understand the diagram. Of course, a diagram should always have a comment below it to explain basically, okay, this is what you should see in this diagram. This is what I want to show, okay? So of course, if you have very, very, very basic diagrams, it's no big deal if you do not write a very long comment, okay? If the diagram is very obvious, be smart about this and tell your students to be smart about this. They should write a comment when it's going to add value to the essay. Okay. If the diagram is a bit difficult to understand, if it deserves an explanation, then of course it should be explained. But generally, a diagram that is not explained, under which there is no comment, doesn't have much value. It's like if you throw a diagram at the face of the examiner and say, okay, you know what I mean, right? No. It is an examination. So it's not sufficient for students to just graph the diagram. They must demonstrate that they understand it. And if you do not write a comment below your diagram to explain it, how can you expect the examiner to assess your skills? It's not possible. So that's why the comment is just there to say, I know what this diagram means. I know why it is relevant to this particular essay question. Probably the most important thing that should be done, the comment. And yes, if you can, if your students can, the diagram and the comment should be on the same page. All right. That's a detail. That's not super important, but that's just to avoid flipping the pages back and forth. To look at the diagram, look at the comment, look at the diagram, look at the comment. So if possible, having the two on the same page would help. And yeah, do not hesitate to define points, point A, point B, point C, P1, P2, Q1, Q2, to identify areas, okay? So if you want to show the impact of an increase in demand on consumer surplus, rather than shading areas, because if you start shading areas, it can be very messy, especially if you have two areas that overlook each other a bit. It's much better to use some points. So you can use those points, A, B, C, P1, Q1, to identify areas. And then in your comment, you can identify these areas using those letters rather than shading areas. Same thing if you want to represent the tax incidence on producers, on consumers, the deadweight laws, the tax revenue. If you start shading areas, it's going to be a mess. So it's much better for the presentation, much clearer to define points, to add some points, A, B, C, D, E, and to use these points to identify those areas. Okay. Overall, this is how a diagram should be used within an essay. So obviously you should have the statement of your point and the explanation of your point. Absolutely. That we talked about that yesterday, how to make a point, statement, explanation. Then if you want to include a diagram, so again, the diagram could be there to support your explanation or to exemplify your point. It doesn't really matter. Before you include the diagram, you skip a line to leave enough space between the text and the diagram. You include the diagram in the center. Okay, so you see that's what I would call an appropriate scale. So of course, the scale must also be adapted depending on how much information you want to show on your diagram. If you have a very simple diagram, it could be smaller. If you have a very complex diagram, it could be larger. Below the diagram, the number and, if possible, the title. We skip one line. We write the comment to explain, hey, this is what there is to see in this diagram. You see it's on the same page, the comment and the diagram. We skip one line and we move on to the next point. So ideally, this is the ideal presentation. Okay, and in practice, sometimes it's a bit difficult to do something as perfect, but that would be the best possible way to present or to use a diagram within one of yours. Okay, let me show you one example. There is one example with price ceiling. You should see it. Okay. So this is meant to illustrate this presentation. So there is, let's say, a previous point. Now I move to a new point. So I state this new point. Okay, can I highlight it? Yeah, okay. So that's the statement of my point. Okay. Then what I have here, can I change color? I don't even know if I can use a different color. No, it's only yellow. Okay, doesn't matter. What I have there is the explanation of my point. Okay. Then I leave enough space between my text and my diagram. I include my diagram, and you see that all guidelines have been followed, apart from the fact that I used colors. But students will not use colors, okay? But apart from that, you see that all the guidelines that all the tips that the rules that I explained earlier have been followed. So yes, this diagram looks pretty good. Below a number and a title, and below a comment. So of course, this comment is very detailed. I could have been more concise, and I don't expect students to write comments that are so detailed. This is just an example, okay? But that's the overall structure of one point that uses a diagram: the statement, the explanation, the diagram to support my explanation, the number, the title, and the comment of my diagram to make sense out of it, to explain and to demonstrate that I know what it means and I know how to use it properly. Okay, let's to finish, let's just have a look at a few examples from students. Sorry, and I missed that. 2 final advices for economics teachers, and then we will have a look at some examples, and that should be enough for the day. So 2 final advices specifically for teachers, not for students. Make sure your students use mini whiteboards. Do you guys have mini whiteboards in your classroom? Do you ask them to draw diagrams on mini whiteboards? I hope you do. In my school, I'm very lucky because we have desks on which they can write. So essentially their desks are whiteboards. So they don't even need mini whiteboards. I just have to give them some markers and they just write directly on their desk. That's perfect. And if you have some a budget for your economics department or for your humanities department, if you do not yet have those desks, well, maybe that's something that you could ask for next academic year, right? To purchase those desks so students can write directly on them. So yeah, that's of course, the more they practice, the better they will become at using diagram. And second advice, please take your time when drawing diagrams on the whiteboard, because yeah, we draw hundreds of diagrams and sometimes we get a bit tired of it and we go very quickly, and ourselves as teachers, we don't apply ourselves. We don't label the axes, we don't label curves, we don't use arrows to show changes. So I believe it is important that every time we draw diagrams, even if it's a bit more time consuming, but that we take enough time to do it properly, just to, well, show the example and just to show students that, yes, it matters. You can't just rush your diagrams. It's always important that you follow all the steps, even if, yes, you have already graphed 10, 12 diagrams within the same lesson. But I think it's important that we maintain the same level of attention and the same commitment to applying ourselves when using diagrams in our classrooms. Otherwise, if you just rush and you just graph a very bad diagram, the message you are essentially sending to your students is that, oh, it's okay to graph a very poor diagram. Look, the teacher does it. So let's try to maintain the same level of application when we draw diagrams in class. Okay, let's have a look at some examples. What do you think about this one? This one here. Is it a good diagram? Is it a bad diagram? What do you think?
It's not a good diagram, Professor, because the new quantity has not been marked. There are not points have not been made, you know. It's not a satisfactory diagram for me. But the axes have been marked properly, food, clothing, I mean, that's good. But what is this curve all about? I mean, this is PPC, you see?
Yes, yeah, you see.
So PPC, yeah. So the first thing they should have written, you know, that what is this curve all about, which is the basic point. Yeah, so it's missing.
Yeah, so there are some things that are good about this diagram. Okay, first, yes, the axes have been labeled. That's good. Second, the student has used a ruler to draw the axes. That's good. 3, there is an arrow to show the shift. That is good. Okay. Now, what is bad? Number 1, yes, the PPCs are not labeled. There should be PPC1, PPC2. You're right, we could have added another value on the horizontal axis over here. Also, this diagram, in my opinion, it is too small. Even if it's a very simple diagram, it would deserve to be larger. And also the diagram, even though I actually took this from AP, so this is not an essay, but within an essay, the diagram should be centered and they should be a number, at least a number below it. And there should also be a title if possible. And you see that this diagram does not have a comment. So again, I took this from AP, so perhaps that's fine. But okay, let's move on. How about this one? Is it a good diagram? Is it a bad diagram? What do you like about it? What do you think could be improved?
First of all, the axis, especially the y-axis, the writing is not clear. So it can't be read that what is the y-axis, what is the x-axis.
I think it says wage, rate, and quantity of labor. But yeah, it's not extremely clear. I agree.
Yeah, and the points have not been well marked. You know, on the curve, the point of intersection of this Q1, you see in the middle of the diagram, it should be labeled as A or B or some points. So points should be marked. And yeah, overall, but not so good.
Yeah, okay, so again, there are some things that are rather positive about this diagram, okay? Again, the axes have been labeled, even if the handwriting is not amazing, but okay, we can read. All curves have been labeled, so that's also something that is good. The points, the values on the axis here have been labeled. However, here you see that the equilibrium weight has not been labeled on the vertical axis. There is a number, diagram 1, below the diagram, even though it's a bit too close to the diagram. Here too, you see that the diagram is too close to the text. And you see what I'm saying when I say that this doesn't look very, very good. It's much better if you have more space between the text and the diagram. What else? Okay. The scale is not bad. It's definitely big enough. You see, it's not, we don't have the problem of a diagram being too small. So it's not bad. It's not bad. And I cropped it, but it seems like there was a comment. I really wanted to focus on the presentation of the diagram, but it seems like the student did write a comment. Okay, so it's not bad, but you see there are a few things that could have been improved. How about this one? Good, bad, so-so?
Well, first of all, the first impression is pleasant to eyes. So it's okay. But the central point should be, which is MES, the central point, the point of intersection, like there is no intersection, but just C and Q, where they meet at the minimum point of the curve. Maybe they can point it somewhere, point A, or, but overall it's good fun.
Okay, again, it's always important to start with the positive. Okay, so what's good about it? Again, it seems like a ruler has been used. The axes have been labeled, even though cost here, it's fine. Doesn't matter if it's average, cost is okay. The curve has been labeled. The value here has been written on the horizontal axis. Actually, MES could have been written here, okay, because the MES is a quantity. C here is a bit vague, so the labeling is not amazing here. You see, again, we have this problem where the diagram is definitely too close to the text. There is not enough space between the text and the diagram. I like it much better when the diagram is centered, simply because we like things that are symmetric. Okay, so it just looks better, that's just how we are designed. And we just enjoy things that look symmetric better. So that's why centering the diagram is often better in terms of presentation. You see, there is no title, there is no number below that diagram. Okay, so it's not bad, but again, it would have been better if there was more space between the text and the diagram, if the diagram had been centered, if a title and number had been added, and if the labels here were a bit more explicit. How about this one? My favorite one.
Good points about it, that it has been like the axes have been marked, but again the arrows are missing. There are arrows in between the demand curves, but I will prefer arrows in parallel to the x-axis and y-axis, close to these axes, because it is easier than for the examiner. But the points have, points have not been marked. The equilibrium points of the supply and demand curve, where they are actually intersecting, these points should be marked. So, but overall, it's a good one, I must say.
Okay. Well, to me, for this one, there is a big problem, is that clearly when we look at the diagram, regardless of whether it is correct or not, it looks bad because the student has not used a ruler. So as the first presentation problem, no ruler has been used, and therefore it looks messy. And also because you see the student has used a pencil that is definitely too thick. So that doesn't make it look very good. The handwriting is not very good. Well, this is WM, so we guess it's minimum wage. Yes, the axes have been labeled, so that's good. All curves have been labeled, so that's good. All values on the axis have been labeled, so that's good. There is an arrow to show the shift in the demand for labor, so this is good. The student has added the label later, so that's good too. But you see this arrow here is very vague. What does it mean? Does it move? Do we move from this equilibrium to this one? No. So this arrow is a bit unclear. And you see, we could have added arrows on the vertical axis and on the horizontal axis to show the change in wage and the change in the quantity, the equilibrium quantity. So the content actually seems all right, but the presentation, mostly due to the absence of a ruler and a very thick pencil, the presentation is definitely